Welcome to the S.M.I.L.E-ing Boys Podcast. This is a podcast that explores a public health approach to improving the mental health of Black boys while challenging the negative stereotypes often associated with this demographic in the society. This is a happiness research-informed podcast themed on the 8 pillars of happiness explored on my research trip to the top 5 happiest countries in the world. Now, isn't that cool? Welcome back to another episode of the S.M.I.L.E-ing Boys Podcast. And today's episode is going to be anchored on one of the 8 pillars of happiness, as we always do. And today's pillar is Togetherness and Belonging, and a specific theme under that pillar would be about the institutions that exist within our society and how they feed or work against the situation around how people of color, especially Black and minority ethnic communities, access those institutions, especially the artistic and creative institutions. So that's what today's conversation will be kind of exploring, how this impacts young people, especially young Black boys, and their trajectory in the society that is supposed to cater for their growth and enable them to thrive equally. So again, as always, we're going to start today's episode with bits of excerpt from various research pieces, and then play you a clip from a group of young boys after a particular trip that I've taken them on the 7th week of the program. I usually take the young people on a trip to experience art in a reputable institution across the country, especially within London. Try to keep it that way. And most of the time we tend to go to Tate, which is one of the most celebrated, reputable art institutions in the world. So this clip I'm going to play you at the point when we play that, we'll be exploring just a debrief from some of the young people around their experiences in that space, and then we can kind of elaborate much further around the context of that clip. Some of the research around representation, diversity, inclusion, and racial injustices in the institution are some of the things that predicate what today's episode would be. So arts institutions and museums in England are being warned they will lose public funding unless they meet stretching targets to create and attract more diverse workforces and audiences. So that's really interesting. They're being warned. And what does this warning look like? What are the consequences of not meeting these stretching criteria that have been set? We're going to explore some of that and how much of that is potentially tokenistic, or how much of that is actually really meant to implement change. So just 11 of workers in England's national portfolio organizations. So national portfolio organizations are organizations in the country that are consistently funded for a period of contract with an art institution, in this case usually the National Art Institution, which is the Arts Council. So they select a particular group of arts institutions across the country that would get maybe a 10-year commitment fund from them to continually fund their art outputs, all the programs, all the creative things that they kind of put out in the next 10 years will be funded by the Arts Council. So to get that status of national portfolio organization is quite a massive feat for a lot of organizations, because that just means that your financial outlay for the next 10 years is being kind of covered. So it's quite a big thing for organizations to be awarded the national portfolio organization. So that's just a bit of context. So just 11% of workers in these organizations, which include galleries, theaters, orchestras, dance companies, museums, all these things, are from Black and other minority ethnic backgrounds. Only 11% of the workers. And in London, the figure is 15%. When it comes to disability, only 6% of people in the arts workforce identify as disabled. Dance has the highest proportion of BME employees at 18%, and the lowest proportion of disabled workers at 3%. Museums have the lowest BME workforce, and that's just at 6%. And London has the highest LGBT representation across the country, and that's at 8%. So just giving like a statistical context around how minority groups in different ways kind of reflect within the creative industries and the art industries. So the annual Arts Council report paints, according to the chair, a disappointing picture when it comes to diversity, a disappointing picture, whatever that means, right? And based on this exploration, they have set different markers of which organizations need to be meeting, exceeding, or failing at meeting the diversity targets, right? Last year, the only organization that exceeded that within London is the Rich Mix organization in terms of exceeding the set out criteria for diversity and inclusion across London when we think about the national portfolio organizations in the country. So that's really fascinating. Critic and curator Maurice Berger cites, people of color have to be given positions of influence and allowed to speak to their own experience for the art world to change. Not until white people who now hold power in the arts scrutinize their own motives and attitudes towards people of color will it be possible to unlearn institutional racism in the art context. So that's very interesting excerpt to just kind of predicate today's conversations around. Statistics show that art and creative subjects are rapidly declining in schools, and our report shows young people are being discouraged from following a creative career path. So that's a Creative Industries Report 2019. So I'm going to play you guys a clip that explores a conversation around some of these young people's experiences by going specifically to Tate and what came out of that discussion.
It was a good day, yeah, but like the security guard, there was no need to keep on getting on to us just because of black, because if there was a group of white boys, you wouldn't be saying that.
When we were in the place, the way people were treating or speaking to you, how did you feel about that?
Oh yeah, that security guard, he was on to everyone.
Yeah?
Yeah, he was jarring.
Yeah, the food was nice.
I didn't like the way that there weren't a lot of black pictures in the museum.
I'm not gonna lie, I didn't really find that gallery that interesting.
Yeah?
But there was like some pictures that were just nice.
Mm-hmm.
But like the whole thing, just like, was a good bonding experience.
I like the part where we took pictures at the museum.
Yeah?
And I like the Nando's part as well.
I like the part where I was filming
Yeah?
the museum.
So that excerpt came after an experience where I took these young boys to that institution where I often take all these young boys after the 7th week of the program to get them to explore art as it is represented in their communities, how most of these young people have never actually been to a museum or a reputable art institution, which is often, in most cases, very close to their neighborhoods and where they live, but for some reason the accessibility is just not present. They just don't feel like they can go into those places, or for whatever reason they've just never been. So I often use this opportunity to take these young people to that institution, all expense paid, and take them to a Nando's afterwards, which often is a treat that they often look forward to. So this particular clip was played after a bunch of young boys' experiences in this particular case in that institution, where they were consistently policed, where they were told to open their eyes and make sure they don't step on things, where they were followed around and told where to lean and where not to lean. Whereas there was multiple groups of young people in that environment, in that particular gallery and museum, often not the black group. So there were lots of other groups of kids from white schools and private schools, potentially, predominantly white groups. And the way that there was a disparity in how they were spoken to, how they were policed in this space, how they were followed consistently and made to, in not uncertain terms, made to feel like this space does not belong to you. You are a stranger in this space. I shall tell you where to go, where not to go, what to lean, how to speak, what levels of your voice is accepted in this space. So it became somewhat a semi-confrontational issue as I had to approach the particular caretaker of that space who was following young people around, and specifically following one young person around and telling him what to do and what not to do and how to speak and where not to put his feet, and calling a manager to come and watch over what it is that they were doing. So I found that quite distasteful and quite problematic. So I approached this woman, and there was a series of back and forths that surfaced from that, to the point where I asked for her name and the details, and she was a white gallery assistant, and she immediately mentioned, "What do you need my name for? You're harassing me." And then she walked away. And at that moment, it was really interesting how the power dynamic and racial dynamic was pretty evident, and that was weaponized in that situation specifically to disarm me, a black male, in an environment where already I feel very uncomfortable, or made to feel uncomfortable. And all of a sudden I ask for what seemingly is my duty to do, that to ask for her name so I could speak to the powers that be around her conduct and how she spoke with the young people. And she automatically refused to do that, as well as saying that I was harassing her just simply because I was asking for her name. So subsequently, a lot of things happened since then. Had great conversations with the institution as a whole, as they took this complaint quite seriously. And we had series of consultations and conversations around that. And there is an open acceptance of a lot of wrongdoings in that instance, and how much more needs to be done within this institution to actually challenge a lot of the institutional racism, a lot of the unconscious bias that a lot of the staff members potentially and the institution kind of purport, and the ways in which they police young people and black young people particularly in this space. So asking these young people, as I do every time, in a debrief, how their experiences were, because I think it's fundamental for young people to be able to articulate what their experiences are in any given context. And listening to the clip, a lot of these young boys spoke about how they were being followed around, especially by this lady and also a security guard who was consistently just telling them where to go and where not to go and where to lean and how not to hold the stairs or whatever it is. And it was pretty evident to these young people that there was a disparity in the way they were spoken to and treated in comparison to a bunch of other kids who were in the same space as them, who were equally as noisy and perhaps rambunctious as well. And then also, a young person talking about how lack of representation of art that looked like people that come from communities that they come from. I mean, London is a very, very diverse city, and the UK generally should be reflective of the multiple ethnicities that make up the country. And while we look at art spaces and art institutions, there is a plague within this institutional representation of art that just erases a lot of this ethnic representations of artists within the community and within the country as a whole. So hearing that specifically from a young person's perspective was something that was really powerful for me to hear, how they were able to witness these things themselves and observe that, how they felt that walking into the multiple rooms that this gallery possesses, seeing a lot of Eurocentric art pieces, seeing a lot of representation of whiteness, seeing a lot of representation of art that is heralded as prestigious, that don't reflect them, don't look like them, or not created by people that look like them. So how then can I, as an artist, one, validate the power of art and creativity to a young person from that background, thinking you can create art and be valued and be respected and make a living from this industry? How can I model to this young person that actually there is a pathway, there's a trajectory for you as a young person that's really interested in creating this and writing this and making this, and seeing that actually you can represent your artwork in places like this? I mean, it makes that job very, very difficult to actually show to this young person that there is a possibility that the things that you are inherently gifted in, the things that you're working on, the things that you're passionate about could absolutely lead you to a position where you're self-sustainable in your art making and in your livelihood through the work that you create. So for me, that was super interesting to really start to experience how this impacts young people from such a young age. And as we talked about with the research, showing that actually a lot of young people and a lot of young people from BME backgrounds are consistently discouraged into pursuing creative ventures in the institutions of education, because there's a lack of value within this industry, even though there's evidence to suggest that, in the past 5 years, the amount of GDP that has been created from the creative industries alone is quite staggering and often unmatched by other industries. So there's evidence to suggest that actually the world that we're going and the world that we move into is heavily creatively reliant, as I'm sure this more virtual digital world that we are in right now consistently highlights that too. So that's something that I think is super fascinating to kind of delve into a little bit in this way. So I guess the question is, with regards to togetherness, why is it important? Is it important to take young people outside of the school environment to experience art in institutions? Is there an importance in that? So for me, I believe there's a vital importance in that, because actually one of the most important things, like I highlighted, is being able to show young people actually that they are equally supposed to be welcomed in spaces like this, spaces that look grand and that look quite opulent, that they should feel like they belong in those spaces. They should not feel like strangers, because this is taxpayers' money. This is money that all their parents and, you know, guardians have earned to keep running. So they actually also have equal access to being in these spaces. That's the first thing, to be able to assert this feeling of value and belonging in spaces like that. The second thing is, again, to be able to practice what we preach when we talk about togetherness and we talk about bonding. We need to be able to do this not just in the context of the school, but actually also formulate healthy discussions as a group when they're out in these kinds of places, to talk about how they feel, to ethnographically explore what's it like being a Black boy in an environment like this where it's predominantly white, and the art in here looks like, you know, it's in the Queen's house. You know, what does that feel like? Get them to start to think about that, to engage and imagine that lived experience. Also, when it comes to being able to start to experience the lack of diversity that also exists within the space, so they can start to critique that. And actually this might sow some seeds in them to think, actually, I want to challenge this. I want to be the one to create art that is also represented in this space and to challenge these institutions. And when that kind of, as I highlighted, that the ways in which these young people were spoken to and treated in that environment, when that happened, one of the young people said to me, Kay, listen, this is why I wild out. This is why if I came in here now and I was banging her up or just shouting, people would have said, oh yeah, you're acting out, man. That's what I expect of you. But that's why I do what I do. Like, I wouldn't let her talk to me like that. And I had to kind of highlight to him at that moment that I absolutely hear all of that and everything that he said. I understand the roots of that, but to actually get to a situation where you can use opportunities like this to seek justice, to seek a change, you have to go via a particular route. And that was very difficult for that young person to understand at that moment. But in the long term, those are the challenges. Because if for whatever reason I justifiably so chose to go via the route that he was speaking of, and I was shouting and raising my voice and making it known to her that actually her behaviors were completely rooted in discrimination and actually bias, that would have changed the series of events that happened afterwards. The meetings that I had with the powers that be that actually was able to challenge the institution, allow them to review a lot of practices and really speak openly about more of the work they need to be doing to address these inequalities within their spaces. That wouldn't have been received in that manner. And that's one of the things that's super important, but that's really difficult and it's really challenging, that for us to be able to get to the position where we can seek for active change and revisitation of policies, there has to be some sort of non-threatening demeanor, non-confrontational approach for people to take what we're saying seriously and put that into account. Because not everybody is going to be able to calm down in the way that I had to be able to address that situation and formulate a 2-page letter as an aftermath. You know, some people would have at that moment actually lost it and justifiably called them to task at that moment. So that's something that was really important and interesting to model to the young person about alternative ways of actually solving conflicts and actually alternative ways of building positive togetherness as a group, because that was something we collectively experienced and we could debrief and talk about that and actually explore what those particular incidents that made us feel devalued, feel hurt and disrespected were, and actually why we were entitled to feel that as a group. So that was really something that I think is super interesting and important to explore. So when we talk about some of the things that were highlighted in the Arts Council report around some of the criteria that are being put and how they're, being threatened that most of these, national portfolio organizations are going to start to lose money if they don't actually meet these and exceed these criteria. How much of that is tokenistic? Because how many of these national portfolio organizations have actually lost money in the last 3-4 rounds of re-tendering for this bid. There's no report to suggest that they have. Majority of the national portfolio organizations in the past 4, 5, 6 years, there's only been 3 or 4 that have dropped out of that status of national portfolio. The same ones have been reinstated year after year, and most of these, as I highlighted, have not exceeded nor really met a lot of this diversity and inclusion criteria and quota and advise and all these things. So actually, when they start to say they're going to start to lose money, at what point is that going to happen? And actually, is that enough of a repercussion when we talk about the long-standing legacy that leaves, the danger that creates in terms of the gap of those who continually access art and actually those who think they can create a livelihood through art? Is losing money as an institution big enough repercussion? And that's a question for us and for institutions as a whole to really start to consider. In this same report, it highlights that all art institutions and organizations are required to integrate diversity into programming in order to get funding. I mean, it's really great to hear that these measures are starting to be put in place, but what does diversity and inclusion look like? On what parameters are these being measured? And it's really important to really start to critique these institutions and actually how much of it is face value, how much of it is really intrinsic within the institution, all the way up the statuses within the institution, the different layers and stratas of senior leadership, all of that. Because that's what real diversity and inclusion is, and that's what it looks like, not when you do a campaign. A majority of the people in the campaign reflect a demographic that doesn't reflect the actual institution. And that's what I think a lot of us are blinded by that a lot when we look at these big brands and institutions and they talk a lot about diversity and inclusion and they really plaster their whole campaigns and, ads with all these beautiful hues and colors and, shades of people. And we think, man, that's really great. But all the way through the actual institution, this is not reflected. All the way through their commissioning of art and work that is in those institutions, that's not the reflection in there. So that's a really interesting dichotomy to really start to kind of challenge with these institutions. When we start to think about the percentage of participation and audience inclusion from minority and Black communities in these spaces, it starts to reflect that a lot of work still isn't being done. Because actually, why is it that a particular institution exists in this borough and there's so many kids that live in that borough but will never go there, have never gone there, their parents never go there? It's not enough for it to just be a free event or to be a free space, but actually what else can be done to be able to actually create better links with these communities? Because that's what's really interesting. What's really frustrating a lot of times is I hear this word or this phrase, hard to reach young people. And it's really funny, myself and another practitioner were talking about this recently, because what is hard to reach? I ain't hard to reach. A lot of the young people at work, I know where they at, all the young people I work with, they ain't hard to reach. The question is, you just ain't reaching them, or you don't know how to reach them. They're not the ones that's hard to reach. You just don't know how to reach them. So I just think that term within the industry as a whole is one that actually begs a very privileged question around who finds it hard to reach this group of young people. And actually, the more they're being told that they're hard to reach, it problematizes their existence, that there's something you're doing that's making it hard for me to get in touch with you. And actually, that's not the case. The case is the reverse. You just don't know. You have not built trust with us. You have not really dismantled a lot of your systems that allow it to be difficult for me to feel comfortable or even to access your space. So instead of that, you are telling everybody that I'm harder to reach or harder to get in touch with. And that's not what the situation is. And I just think it's important to really explore that and to challenge that when we start to discuss some of the challenges between accessibility from institutions to diverse audiences, and not look at the audiences as the ones who are the problem or are difficult to access or engage with. Another important thing is then to start to think about, can this situation of COVID-19 be an important time for us to start to revisit some of the practices, some of the policies, the protocols within these institutions? Because the majority of all these institutions have been shut down for at least the past 6 to 8 weeks. And I know everybody's thinking, how can we still exist post social distancing and all of this stuff? But actually, what is also important to start to explore and to think about and question in these times is, how can we really start to do the work of diversity? How can we use this opportunity to realize that actually, as the health and mortality rates are showing us the inequalities and disparities between the rest of the population and the BME minority black communities in terms of the amount of people who are dying more and who are more likely to be affected, being disproportionately black and minority groups, realizing that in the same way in the art industry, there's a marked difference in the amount of people that access those institutions, the amount of people whose work is being represented and commissioned in these institutions, and a lot more needs to be done. So this time should be used to revisit, as we have seen, and I'm a very big lover of this quote about, there is not going to be a normal when we come back to whatever that looks like. It's about we need to redesign what a new normal is, because normal as it was didn't serve a lot of people. Normal as it was didn't serve the planet, as it were, didn't serve the communities that are on the margins and on the fringes. So actually what we need to do is to use this time to radically redesign and restructure what the new normal can look like that can serve everyone equally. And that is a challenge for sure, but we need to be committed to doing that. And I really, laid the gauntlet at the doors of a lot of these institutions to really start to do that. And I'm trying to, have a lot of conversations with so many institutions at the moment who, I walk in there and I feel like there is no representation of people that look like me, art that looks like me, or art that even remotely speaks to my lived experience. And it's not because these artists don't exist. It's because there has not been an emphasis and there has not been a prioritization of work and art from that demographic, and that needs to swiftly change in these times. Can schools and parents also start to actually value the work that is going to happen when you take young people, especially young black boys and young, minority ethnic groups to these institutions to radically challenge these spaces? Because actually one thing that's been really interesting is in the Tate, because of the exhibition that was created by Steve McQueen, which was about young people and young Londoners. Because of that, a lot of young people have been accessing that building. And it's really incredible to see that. But they've had to radically change their protocols and their behavioral policies because there's been more young people that have been coming into the building. But it's taken for that exhibition for them to change that. But actually, there still has to be much more that has to be done in terms of actually culturally training staff to understand and to provide a safe space for all young people of different demographics, especially culturally trained, to understand and to experience what it's like to have young people of color in that space. They're not going to be quiet and talking like this. Yes, they're going to have energy and they're going to be rambunctious, but that's not disruptive. That's not threatening. And having that type of exposure to a multitude of diverse groups to understand that actually, there are these nuances and we need to also be aware, because when we have culturally diverse staff members, these things are not going to be having to be told to them. These are things that are in lived experiences that can be shared and cascaded across. And I think a lot of this work needs to be done consistently in institutions. And that's a lot of work that I'm also doing alongside working directly with young people who's trying to challenge and deliver training in a lot of these institutions to really culturally upskill a lot of the staff members and the institution as a whole in terms of their policy and the protocols to be able to be quite diverse in its ethos. And parents, I think, need to also start to challenge this a little bit more, to start to take their kids to these spaces, even if they're not going to understand the art, even if they're not going to see things that look like them, at least get them to start to become familiar, to start to feel like they belong in these spaces, that they also have the rights to be in these spaces. Because the longer that they are alien and estranged from these spaces, the longer they become desensitized to the need for them to be in those spaces, and actually seeing that they can also create in those spaces and belong to those spaces as well. So that's really something that I would like to kind of challenge a lot of parents and guardians to really start to do that much more on schools and institutions. Because what's really interesting is a lot of times I have to advocate for the boys that I'm working with to be able to take them on this trip, because they tend to be the young boys who are often in isolation units, who are often in detention. So therefore they have revoked their rights to be taken on any school trip. And I make that a critical point in my negotiation with the school, that I would be taking these boys on trips, whether or not they are the type that you don't give the access to on my program. I am going to take them on a trip, and I am going to pay for all of that. I am going to do the risk assessment. Of course, I am aware that yes, you think they are probably the most disruptive young people. They are probably going to fight outside. That's what you think. But we are going to create a togetherness, a belonging that's predicated upon respect and accountability. And actually, on top of that, we would be able to go out there with no problems and come back with no problems. And to date, there hasn't been any problem with the groups of about 100 young people that have taken on different trips. So I think it's really important for schools to be challenged on that, to start to take young people, all young people, on these trips, not just the ones who are well behaved, as they would like to term that, and not the ones who are disruptive, or not the ones that are taken. So it's really important to start to challenge that, because then that again creates a self-fulfilling prophecy that I don't deserve art. And that is a very problematic route to go down, especially for young people. That's kind of my overview in terms of how the institutions play a part in continually othering young people and actually creating this bigger gap between access and representation in those spaces, and to really start to challenge institutions when they talk about diversity and inclusion, how much of that is really about the infrastructure and the consistent core of that organization or institution, as opposed to just on face value. One thing I'm going to ask is for anyone to share in the comments an instance where you've had a really positive experience in an art institution, or a very appalling experience in an art institution, and how have been your thought processes around that. It'd be really great and interesting to hear some of that. So thank you guys again for paying me your attention and really giving me your ear in today's conversation. Hopefully it really struck some chords with anyone that's listening around what you can do to consistently challenge institutions, to challenge, the powers that be, to create more visibility, representation, access for young people of color in these spaces, and how, hopefully today we've heard things that has made us realize actually that this is a really long-standing problem. This is something that we in so many cases are participators in, because sometimes what I hear is we go into spaces like that and it's part of the audience that is policing other people in the space. Like, who gave you the right to tell me to keep quiet? What is that about? So really challenging those things when we see that, seeing other people who take it on themselves to go around policing other people in these art institutions because they believe they have the right to do that. And who gives them that right? That's a question to be posed to them. So hopefully today really kind of challenges us to really think about our part in this and how we can consistently create a world that's much more inclusive, much more diverse to young people, to people of different abilities, to different genders, and to really start to not take no for an answer. And that's where I think we are at the moment. So yes, it's really great, and I would love to have more conversations and consultations with different institutions around how they can become much more inclusive in their practice, how they can actually shorten the gap between the young people of minority, Black communities, ethnic minority communities in accessing the institutions, because by stipulation in a lot of the grants and a lot of the funding that they get, it's their right to be able to do that. It's actually part of their criteria to consistently reflect the demographic of London and the country in their spaces by their programming as well as their audience participation. So actually they need to be doing more. So get in touch with me for us to have these discussions, to continually figure out how we can bring the S.M.I.L.E-ing Boys into those spaces and how we can use that as a beginning of a conversation to bridge the gap between these communities, because the work needs to be done. We are not hard to reach. These young people are not hard to reach. You just don't know how to do it. And for that to happen, you need to be in consultation with people who are deeply rooted in these communities, in these organizations that are community led, and how we can then start to create a better bridge between the communities. So thank you guys so much for today, and I look forward to catching you guys on the next episode. Hope you have a wonderful